All right, we're gonna do a review for what? It's moving without me touching it. Why is this happening? There we go. We're gonna do a review for exam 4. Um, and let's go. The little man is asleep right now. I know I promised you guys that he'd be here for this one, but I started too late. So I'll just post a video of him later. Totally separate dog video. I'm sorry. Okay, so sound. First of all, what is frequency? This is like, it's sound, but it's also a little bit of hearing cognition. So what is frequency? Well, it is cycles per second. That's the actual measure. But it's also the physical analog of pitch. Pitch is what we hear, like do, 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 do. That's something ascending in pitch. It's also ascending in frequency. So you can measure the actual cycles per second, the number of cycles of a sine wave per second. And our experience of that is pitch. Usually pitch and frequency are correlated, but there are times when they're not. What is amplitude? Remember that you can pause the video and try to answer the questions before you hear me give you the answer. So what is amplitude? It is the magnitude of the wave. So again, if you have a sine wave, you're looking for how large is that wave. And that's going to correspond to how loud the wave actually is. And it's the physical analog of loudness. So amplitude is the actual height of the wave, the actual physical analog of loudness. Loudness. Intensity is the other word that we use for amplitude often. So the actual height of this sine wave is the intensity of the wave that's coming towards you, the intensity of the sound. And usually that corresponds to how loud we think it is. But again, you can have things that sound like they get louder and they actually remain at the same intensity. But usually intensity and loudness go together, just like frequency and pitch. Okay, how are waves combined? Well, waves are combined in an additive way, which means that if you have two that are stacked like this, and you have two sources that are producing these waves, let's say the amplitude of both of those waves is 0.3, then that means that when the sound gets to you, it's going to be 0.6. You just add those together. So the amplitude is going to get larger. If you have two of the exact same wave coming towards you from two sources, they'll add together and get larger. And that means that waves can also cancel each other out when they're exactly opposite. So when one is coming up in its portion of the sine wave, here's a whole sine wave. But if you have one that's in this up portion of the sine wave and the other is in this bottom portion of the sine wave, these, when you add them together, are just going to cancel each other out. And there will not be that sound anymore. Those two sounds are gone. Remember I told you that there was an exhibit at a museum in Germany where all of the sounds that are coming in are inverted by a bunch of little speakers, and then that sound is shot back out around this cube, and you can stand in this cube, and it is a completely silent cube. It's really cool. It's amazing. What is a pure tone? Well, another name for a pure tone is a sine wave. It's the most typical pressure wave. I know if you think of like what is the textbook definition of a pressure wave, it's a sine wave. So if you think of how our vocal folds work, air goes out, air goes out, air goes out. You can model that with approximately a sine wave. In 310, you'll learn that in 310 and 375, you'll learn that it's not an exact sine wave because of the ways that the vocal folds actually move. It's not a perfect sine wave, but you can kind of model it with a sine wave, basically. So what happens is pressure comes out and the sine wave would go up. This is modeling that you have like increased pressure, and then that drops off, goes back to a 0 point, and then you have decreased pressure. And so you just have increased pressure, decreased pressure, increased pressure, decreased pressure. And how quickly that cycles is the cycles per second. And that then moves through the air, gets to your tympanic membrane, and causes it to vibrate. And so there you have cycles per second vibration of the tympanic membrane, which becomes cycles per second vibration in the ossicles, which then becomes cycles per second vibration in the cochlea, or the basilar membrane. Basilar membrane is a membrane in the cochlea. And then that is transferred to an actual neural impulse at the hair cells, and it goes to the auditory cortices. But anyway, that all comes from pure tones. Pure tones make up all other sounds. Every sound, the sound of my voice, the sound of anything that you've heard today at all, can be decomposed into a bunch of different sine waves. So they're the kind of building block of sound. Okay, what are the parts of the external ear? There's two main ones we want to talk about. We have the pinna and the external auditory canal. Both of these can change the shape of the sound that's coming in. They're both used for localization. Think about a sound coming from in front of you versus behind you. The ear is shaped so that the sound coming from in front of you will be kind of scooped up by the ear and funneled into the external auditory canal. Whereas a sound coming from behind you is going to be kind of deflected by the back of your ear. So there's a very different sound that's coming from in front of you versus behind you. And that is a big help in localization. Now, what about parts of the middle ear? We talked about some of these in general, the ossicles, but what are they? There we go. So we have the tympanic membrane, which we also call the eardrum. That's the first step to the middle ear. It's the dividing line between the external ear and the middle ear is the tympanic membrane. So we've got the tympanic membrane, then we've got the ossicles, and those are made up of the malleus, incus, and stapes. You can think about them as hammer, anvil, and stirrup, but if you do think about them that way, I want you to also know those Latin names, malleus, incus, and stapes. That's how I refer to them in the exam. That's how I'll refer to them in 310. I think that's how pretty much all of the instructors refer to them in 310. So if you know malleus, incus, and stapes, you're good. Or not 310, 311. Sorry, 311 is where we talk about the ear. So we'll call them by those names. So those are the small bones in the middle ear. We also have a eustachian tube in the middle ear. And what this does is it equalizes pressure between the outside world and your middle ear. So if you have a eustachian tube that is blocked for some reason, this can cause a buildup of pressure. It can actually rupture the eardrum. So that's not a good thing. And when you're traveling from one elevation to another, either higher or lower, the reason why you yawn or chew gum or something like that is to continue popping this eustachian tube open to equalize the pressure. Okay, what about in the inner ear? What's going on there? That's right. There's the cochlea. Perilymph is the fluid that's inside the cochlea. We talk about the cochlea as a fluid-filled organ, fluid-filled hearing organ. And what it's filled with is perilymph. I don't have a question about perilymph, but essentially it's the same thing as cerebrospinal fluid. If you take 310 with me, we're going to talk about that, but it's not in this exam. And then the hair cells, those are actually in the cochlea, but they're an important thing to know. There are three. Do I have another question about this? No. There are 3 layers of outer hair cells and 1 layer of inner hair cells. The outer hair cells kind of act like a compression algorithm, so they'll boost quiet sounds and limit loud sounds. The inner hair cells actually interface directly with the auditory nerve. So they're actually going to transduce sound from a mechanical force, at this point it's a mechanical force, into a neural impulse. Okay, how are sounds limited? We've got a couple different ways. One is the stapedius and tensor tympani muscles. This is acting on the tympanic membrane. They can innervate and stiffen up the tympanic membrane. If you're an ear rumbler, this is what you're doing when you rumble your ears. You're activating these muscles and causing your tympanic membrane to stiffen up. Do it if you are a rumbler the next time that there is a kind of loud sound, and you'll notice that you don't hear that sound as much. You can do it, I guess, when there's a quiet sound and you notice that you don't hear that sound as much. This is because the tympanic membrane is stiffening because you're flexing those muscles, basically. The other way that we can limit loud sounds is what I mentioned about the 3 layers of outer hair cells. They're going to limit loud sounds and boost quiet sounds. So we've got these 2 methods. What creates the neural impulse in the cochlea? Well, the hair cells bend. And basically what happens then, if you got these hair cells, well, let's just do one. You got these hair cells, they bend, and actually bending them pulls on the hair cell, and it allows neurotransmitters to be released. And then those neurotransmitters link up with actual neurons, and that starts a process of firing that leads to the brain. The cortical location of sound processing. Where is sound processed in the brain? What are the names of all these different places? It is the auditory cortex, or the primary auditory cortex. So A1, primary auditory cortex, was also known as Heschel's gyrus. And this is in the temporal lobe, specifically the superior temporal lobe. Okay, so this is important. This is important for the exam. It's also important just for life. Anything above 85 decibels is considered to be harmful to your hearing. You need to limit your exposure to sound over 85 decibels. And, you know, traffic noise inside a car is 80. But what I've been thinking about lately is when I listen to podcasts and music in my car, I turn it up above the noise of the road, which means that probably it's at 85 decibels or above. So I'm probably in the range where I need to like turn that down. This is specifically bad when I'm on the 101. The 101 is really noisy. So what I like to do is I like to just take surface streets and like cruise. Like I'll just get a coffee and just like drive home kind of slow, just listening to a podcast and like chilling. It's good. It's quieter. It's nice. I'll just hang out in the right lane for like hours. Okay. You need to know 85 decibels for your exam. Now it's not moving. There we go. There we go. Okay. So we have 2 different graphs here. The one on the left is for children, very young children. And the one on the right is for older children and adults. What's important to notice here is that they do not have the same cutoff for hearing loss. There is a new category for young children, which is called slight hearing loss. If you notice that you need to give a baby or a 1-year-old 15 decibels of amplification of a sound before they hear it, remember this can be measured with auditory brainstem response, like we talked about in, I think it was the oral rehab. Somebody talked about that. You can measure that way. If you need to give them 15 decibels of amplification for, again, a baby or a 1-year-old, that's considered slight hearing loss, and that goes to 25 decibels. After that, the categories are all the same, but there is this different cutoff at the slight range, the lower range, for very young children. And then for older children and adults, it's just 20 decibels of amplification. Above that, we consider that mild hearing loss, and below that is normal hearing from 0 to 20. Our frequency range of hearing is 20 to 20,000. I mean, effectively, it's a little bit more narrow than that. Like it could be 50 to or 40 to 19,000 or something like that. But 20 to 20,000 is kind of the generally agreed upon term. It's also easy to remember, 20 to 20,000. We talked about that already. Okay, so what about hearing disorders? What is a conductive hearing loss? Well, conductive hearing loss means that you have a problem with transducing the sound in either the external or middle ear. The hair cells are just fine. Everything is going okay at the point of the inner ear. It's really the outer and middle that you have a problem. Again, the hair cells work fine, but the sound pressure wave is obstructed somehow. You can't reach the tympanic membrane, or it can reach the tympanic membrane, but it can't reach the cochlea. And that's how you have conductive hearing loss. Bone conduction still works, though. So if you have a bone conduction device, a person with conductive hearing loss would hear just fine with a bone conduction headset. This is the most repairable kind of hearing loss because sometimes it's just wax, sometimes it's something else in the ear. It can be a problem with the ossicles, but those can be fixed surgically sometimes. Not all the time, but sometimes. And the other thing is, it's really easy to work around even if it's not repairable, because we can give these people either bone conduction headsets, just like headphones for the short term, and they can also have implanted bone conduction devices for the long term. But no real invasive surgery into the inner ear or anything like that, because that's all fine. It's not in danger. What about sensory neural hearing loss? Well, this one is a little worse. What's going on here is that the hair cells have died. We've got hair cell loss. The signal can't be transduced into a neural impulse because that requires hair cells. And if they're gone, they're gone. They can't do that job. This is permanent because we can't regrow hair cells. There are some interesting studies recently that show maybe at some point we could use technology and gene editing and stuff like this to help us regrow hair cells, but that could be 10 to 100 years off from now. As the science currently stands, no, we can't regrow hair cells. Once you've damaged your hearing, it's permanent. And even if there is a cure for this eventually, we don't know when it's going to happen. So it's best just to not take the chance and protect your hearing, when you can. What about mixed hearing loss? Well, mixed hearing loss is a little bit of both. You have hair cell loss, but you also have too much wax in your ears or anything like that. So the sound wave is getting pushed up against the tympanic membrane, but there's a bunch of wax in there, so it kind of dampens the sound before it gets to the tympanic membrane. And then there's some hair cell death, so you have a combination of the two things. Which of these is most likely to cause distortion? Sensory neural is most likely to cause distortion. Because sensory neural is a component of mixed hearing loss, you could say that you could see that it's present in mixed hearing loss as well, but it's the sensory neural component of the mixed hearing loss that causes the distortion. The reason there is that there's possibly entire frequency bands that aren't being used because those hair cells could be dead. Also, sometimes with sensory neural hearing loss, it's caused by tumors or problems with the nerve, and sometimes problems with the brain. And so that can all cause distortion as well. Oh, there's the answer that I just gave you. Okay, so let's take a look at these audiograms. Which of these is a conductive hearing loss? Bone conduction would be fine, but air conduction is not. Remember, the greater than, less than signs are bone conduction, and the circles and X's are air conduction. Greater than, less than is going to be the difference between left and right, and open circle X is the difference between left and right. But greater than, less than is always bone conduction. So in conductive hearing loss, bone conduction is fine, but air conduction is not. And which of these matches that description? We'll talk about it in a second. With sensory neural, you're going to have air conduction and bone conduction both impaired to the same extent. So which one of those matches that description? And then lastly, with mixed, both bone conduction and air conduction are impaired, but they're impaired to different degrees. The air conduction is going to be impaired more than the bone conduction in mixed. That's because, of course, bone conduction can get around the problems of some sort of conductive hearing loss. But if there's still sensory neural, then that's still going to affect the bone conduction hearing. So, well, I didn't make it so the names popped up. Okay, so I'll tell you. So which one is conductive? It's this one. You can see that bone conduction is totally fine, and air conduction is disordered a little bit. Sensory neural, both of them are equal. That's this blue one here. Everything's equal. And then process of elimination, mixed is going to be this one right here. You can see that everything is disordered. This bone conduction is below 20 decibels. And so then we would consider that disordered, but they're not right on top of each other. It's showing that air conduction is disabled more so than bone conduction. And so that's indicative of a mixed hearing loss. There we go. So now we're going to talk about device management. What are each of these good for? Hearing aid versus bone conduction versus cochlear implant. Well, a hearing aid is just going to boost the sounds that are hard to hear, right? It's going to make those sounds louder. Anybody is a candidate for a hearing aid. Bone conduction basically does the same thing as a hearing aid. It's going to amplify the sounds that are necessary, but it does this in a different way. It does it by converting the sound pressure waves into vibrations, and then that moves through the skull and then vibrates the inner ear. Like we talked about earlier, these can be implanted if you need these long term. So these are kind of the next jump up from hearing aids. And then cochlear implant is actually going to use an electrode to stimulate the cochlea. Well, not the cochlea. It's going to stimulate directly the auditory nerve, I should say. It replaces the hair cells, replaces all the other ear structures. So it's a little bit more invasive surgery. And not everybody is a candidate for a cochlear implant. You have to have certain scores on different tests. 40% sentence recognition unaided, then you're a possible candidate for a cochlear implant, and 60% in the best aided condition, 60% sentence recognition in the best aided condition. If you meet those two criteria, it's probably time to start thinking about a cochlear implant. Electric acoustic stimulation is that half and half that we were talking about. Half hearing aid, half cochlear implant. The high frequency is getting help from the cochlear implant because high frequencies don't really function very well with the hearing aid anyway. So cochlear implant can help with those. And lower frequencies are boosted with the hearing aid. This allows the ear to work in the same way that it used to, because there are some hair cells in the lower frequencies that can be assisted with a hearing aid. What are the benefits of different size of hearing aid is what I'm talking about here. Larger hearing aids are able to contain more technology. They have greater customization, so our frequency bands can be a little bit smaller, and we can adjust those more perfectly to what somebody needs, the amount of amplification that somebody needs to hear the way that they should. You also have the ability to remove these and put them back in when you want. So like if you're a swimmer, you definitely want a larger hearing aid. You can take it off when you want and put it back in. Now we have much smaller hearing aids. These are smaller, they're less visible, but at the same time, you can't fit as much technology into it. So if you have really profound hearing loss or strange curves in your audiogram, you might not be able to have a really small hearing aid that can help with those problems. You might need a larger one. Also, you have to go to an audiologist to have these replaced or removed. Sometimes you can remove it on your own, but to have it placed back in, you need to visit an audiologist. So if you have a lifestyle where you're going to be taking your hearing aid out a lot, well, these small ones are not for you. And if you have motor issues, like some older people might, even a small hearing aid that you can take out and put back in yourself, it might be too small for them. So those are all things to think about. And so I'm kind of answering the next question here. You need to look at the lifestyle of the person, their manual dexterity, their desire, like what do they want? Is it important for people not to see that you have a hearing aid? Then that's really what's going to be pushing our decision here, if that's a very important thing for the person. And if it's not, well, then there's other things driving the decision. And lastly, their self-image. What do they think of themselves as using? And they'll tend to, if their self-image is a person who doesn't need a hearing aid, they will wear one of those small, completely in the canal hearing aids more often than one of the large ones. So if your goal is to help them hear, then you have to get what they want. Okay, when's the best time to get a cochlear implant in the lifespan? Earlier is better. If you can get it into a person while they're still a child, they will grow up thinking that the cochlear implant world is their whole world. This is how they hear. The brain will accommodate for this. And so that's the best time to get the cochlear implant. You have much better speech intelligibility outcomes with cochlear implant. Should you get one or two? This is for cochlear implants and also hearing aids. Well, if one side has normal hearing for a cochlear implant, then you should only get one. That's also true for a hearing aid. So if you have normal hearing in your left ear and it's just your right that's affected, then you should only get one. However, some people only get one no matter what. But if you're completely deaf, bilateral cochlear implant will give you better auditory information. It's more like having two ears. So you should consider undergoing the surgery a second time if you are completely deaf. The speech intelligibility scores show that that's more effective. Two are more effective than one. Okay, oral rehab. Who's going to have a harder time adjusting to hearing loss? Really young people or older people? Definitely adults. The older the person, the more difficulty you can expect. That's just because they've lived most of their life without needing some sort of hearing aid. They have no hearing loss. They have no idea how to cope with it. But again, if you have a person who has always had hearing loss from the very time that they were born, that's their world. They know how to deal with that. It might be troublesome to deal with people who, talk too quietly for you because you don't have very good hearing, but at least you know what to expect. You know that people are going to be talking more quietly. You know you have to explain to them, I can't hear you very well. Can you talk louder? But if you're an older person, this is all strange new stuff that you have to get used to. Well, now, what can happen as a result of this hard time adjusting to hearing loss? Well, they can develop depression. They can isolate themselves from others and start to pull away, and even some other psychological issues as well. What is our goal with oral rehab? To improve day-to-day communication. That's it. Is it with a hearing aid? Is it with a cochlear implant? Is it without any of those? Is it with sign language? Yes. The answer is basically yes. I mean, for different people, yeah. All those are options. There's no particular thing that we're pushing with oral rehab. We don't need everybody to get a device to have them hear again. We don't need everybody to learn sign language if they're deaf. It's whatever's going to improve day-to-day communication. That's what you're there for. About how many people are going to have some sort of hearing loss by 75? 50% of the population will have hearing loss by age 75. So if you want to be an audiologist, you're never going to be out of work. People are still going to get old. And a lot of us will have hearing loss. So what about the capital deaf versus the lowercase deaf? Well, lowercase deaf is just describing, a person who can't hear, basically. The sound isn't transduced into a neural signal. That person is deaf. But deaf with the capital D is deaf culture. It's a community of deaf people. And they kind of have all the same things that a normal culture does. They have a common bond. There's cultural history. There's inside jokes. There's all sorts of things, just like any other culture. And you can have people that aren't completely deaf as part of the deaf culture. So it's not necessarily only people who are completely deaf who are part of the deaf community. That's the difference between those two. Okay, what about auditory cognition? What is a natural regularity? We talked about this a little bit, but what is it? It's two qualities in the world that often change together. So frequency and intensity tend to change together. As something goes up in frequency, it also gets louder. This is so ubiquitous that we just tend to perceive that those happen even when they don't. If a sound gets if a sound gets louder, we tend to feel like it got higher pitched. Some examples, motion on the retina, right? And movement, correlating those two together. The Doppler, I was going to say Doppler shift, but that's about stars. The Doppler effect and the Doppler illusion. The fact that the Doppler effect just makes frequency go boo, like that. That's the Doppler effect. The Doppler illusion is the fact that we think that it goes boo, and you have a much larger pitch change than what actually happened. So that's an example. What is the relationship of frequency and intensity? Well, we talked about that. They're correlated. And think about the Doppler illusion. What are the main dimensions of sound perception? We talked about this, about my research. Well, consonance is one of the primary dimensions on which sounds are organized. Consonance and dissonance. Also, tone height. One way to think about tone height is by thinking about vowel phonemes. But that kind of structure, the thing about vowel phonemes that isn't pitch, it isn't intensity, It's the quality that makes it an E sound like an E versus an oo. The way that those formants and harmonics work together, that's called tone height. That's another primary dimension of sound perception. So consonants and tone height are two really important things. This is when you're controlling for frequency and intensity. All right, and that's it. That's it for exam 4. I think you'll do well. There's not as many lectures in this part, I think, and so there's not as much to study. Anyway, study these. Know all of the inside and out, not just so you can like restate these answers back. That'll help you get a pretty good grade, but if you want a really good grade, you have to understand each concept, because I won't just ask you to kind of like regurgitate what you see here. I want you to apply it to some new situations on some of the questions. So if you know this by heart, you'll do okay. And if you understand the inner workings, you'll do really well. I won't make one of these for exam 5. Just watch all the different review videos, and exam 5 is just going to pull existing questions from the other 4 exams. And then you can take it if you want. Remember, your lowest exam gets dropped, and if you don't take the final, that becomes your lowest exam, and that's the one that's dropped. So if you do have an exam that you would like to be dropped, say 1 or 2 or something like that, then you need to take the final and see how you do on it. Well, that's it. That's pretty much the end of class. If you have questions, be sure to email me. Good luck on this exam. Good luck on the final. Good luck on homework 3, and I'll talk to you soon. All right, bye. I still have to end the video, so now we have that awkward, I already said bye, trying to hang up.